Well, hello again, folks, and thank you ever so much for tuning in to Haunted Headphones, your favorite new podcast where we discuss all things paranormal and intriguingly strange. I hope everyone is having a fantastic week so far, and I'd also like to give a personal thank you to those of you that have followed and subscribed and checked out episode 0 to get a feel for what this podcast is all about. I really appreciate your attention, and I'm absolutely thrilled that you've decided to join me on this adventure through the strange land. As I mentioned previously, Halloween is my favorite holiday, and while I literally can't count the reasons why I love it so much, I can tell you that one of them is the energy in the air. It's been believed for many years in many cultures all around the world that Halloween is the time when the veil between the worlds is at its thinnest. This is the time where the living and the dead have been thought to often cross this invisible boundary between this life and the next. How do you feel about Halloween, dear listener? Do you feel an extra bit of ghostly presence this time of year? Can you hear the whispers from across the veil? I know I can, and some of them have become my very best friends. On Haunted Headphones, we'll be bringing you many different types of content, and as we take this journey through the strange land together, we'll likely be trying things out and changing things along the way, and it's all for the sake of bringing you the best stories. For episode 1, I thought I'd take the liberty of presenting you with a Haunted Headphones original. But before we do that, I'd like to set the stage by telling you about an experience I had when I was a kid. For many people, Halloween isn't the only time of year that the veil between the worlds is crossed. Maybe that's the case for some of you listening right now. I know that's how it was for me when I was younger. There's something about childhood that allows us to interact with the spirit world in very unique ways. Some say it's because when we're young, we've crossed the boundary of life and death more recently than when we are older. And so we can more easily move and interact between the worlds when we are children. I've been no stranger to paranormal events all throughout my life, but I would definitely agree that things were the most active when I was a kid. And that's what this story is about. You see, when I was younger, about maybe 5 or 6 years old, I was the type of kid with a wild imagination. The type of kid that liked to have elaborate playtime with action figures and create insane scenarios with all kinds of characters. The type of kid that would drive you absolutely crazy after a while. So often, I was best left alone in my room so I could create my very own strange land. When I would play at that age, I liked to voice and be all the different characters and would regularly switch between the hero, the villain, or the person that needed to be saved. So it wasn't uncommon that a parent or a relative would stumble upon me, seemingly talking to myself in a crazy voice. And after a while, it became known that I just did stuff like that all the time. When you're that into playtime, sometimes your loved ones just get tired of playing so intensely with you. And I can't really blame them. I was a psychopath. I was perfectly content to play alone. But if you dared to play with me, I expected you to play the character. It's like, if you're gonna pick up my Batman, you have to do it right, you know? Otherwise, Joker might have to kill you. But you see, that just sounds crazy coming out of a 6-year-old's mouth, right? So naturally, they all thought I had demons in me. And they chose not to play. But you know who was the king of playtime? Aside from my father, of course, who just happened to always be very busy, was one of my grandpas. And he was just crazy enough to play with me. It didn't matter what I put in front of him, what I asked of him, or what the mission was. He was always there. Until one day, he wasn't. That was the first brush with death that I had ever experienced, and it took me a while to understand that he had passed and what that really meant. I didn't struggle with the concept of death. I understood the logic of it. It's just that I didn't feel like he was gone. Still felt like he was there. Eventually we did the whole wake funeral process, and I had to see his body. It was the first dead body I had ever seen, and I still remember it vividly to this day. This was not my grandpa. It just looked like him. That was my first real understanding of what a spirit was. It had clearly left. Kids being as resilient as they are, though, after the few hurdles I had encountered and having to grow up a little bit, I was back to playtime. Heroes, villains, and all the voices included. I recreated some of my favorite scenes, and sometimes I got so into it that it seemed like my grandpa was actually right there with me. I would gesture and respond to him as if he was really there. More than once, my parents would stumble upon me playing, and they would say, "Who are you talking to?" And I would say, "Grandpa." As I said it, it never really felt to me like he was gone. Sometimes I think it was just an overactive imagination, but one Christmas, many years later, one of our favorite grandpa stories came up, as they often do around the holidays, and it led me to tell a different story about Grandpa. It was just a simple story, just of some fond memories I had with him and some of the times we spent together and the conversations that we'd had. Only to everybody else, it was apparently much more frightening than that. My mother had me clarify the story, and after piecing all the details together said, "Well, that can't be." When I looked at her puzzled, she said to me, "Well, it would be impossible. He would have been dead for all of that." Kids can sure be creepy, can't they, folks? Hopefully that little intro helped put your mind in the right state for tonight's episode, dear listeners. I also wanted to invite you to tell me about your own stories. Do you have any childhood memories of speaking with or seeing ghosts or spirits? Maybe your child talks to imaginary friends that may or may not actually be there. Leave a comment and share your experiences with me. Additionally, if you could kindly give us a like, a follow, and subscribe to the channel, we would be ever so grateful. If you've made it this far into episode 1 of Haunted Headphones, I'd like to thank you for your continued attention and for joining us for story time. And without further ado, I'd now like to share one of my most favorite stories with you. So settle in and relax as we explore the first Haunted Headphones original. This story is called The Red Room. Nicole woke up to the familiar tug, pulling at the edge of her blanket. The room was black, still night. Her hands blindly searched the edge of her night table until she found her phone. "It's 3:30 in the morning, Charlie. What are you doing awake?" she asked in the darkness. "I can't sleep. My room is too bright," Charlie said. Nicole's eyes began adjusting to the room. She saw Charlie standing at the foot of the bed and noticed the hall light outside of his room was still on. It must have woken Charlie. He was a very light sleeper. She found Charlie's hand and grabbed it and said, "Let's go to bed, bud. We've got a big day tomorrow." And tomorrow was a big day. It was Halloween after all, and this was a town that lived for Halloween. It was also going to be Charlie's 6th birthday, and they were going to go trick-or-treating for the first time. Charlie hadn't shown much interest in trick-or-treating before. Nicole assumed it was because he was just too young until now, but this year, Charlie was determined. He had even asked Nicole to help him make a costume. "Will you make sure the light's off?" Charlie asked, as Nicole helped him into bed. "Yep, just make sure you get some sleep, okay? And hey, happy birthday, buddy," she said. Thanks. Nicole left the room and headed back to bed. At the end of the hall, she made sure to hit the light switch. Turning off the light she thought was bothering Charlie, and closed her bedroom door, leaving it open just a little in case Charlie was up again before the morning. She sat at the edge of the bed and tapped her phone once again. 3:33 a.m. She sighed and gave a small shiver. She hadn't quite gotten used to the fall chill in the air, and the house was freezing. She settled into bed and began to drift off to sleep, hoping Charlie could get some rest tonight. It had been several nights in a row that he had woken her up in a similar fashion. She thought he was just excited for Halloween and that soon it would pass. As all was getting quiet, Charlie's room began to slowly fill with a bright crimson glow. Charlie pretended not to hear them. He didn't like the shadows. He didn't like the red room, and he didn't want to do it. Happy birthday, Charlie. We're coming, Charlie. You're out of time, Charlie. The next morning, Nicole went to get Charlie ready for school. He had just started first grade here in Cedar Falls, and while he was doing pretty good, he was having a little trouble adjusting and socializing with the other kids. Especially the last few weeks with the sleepless nights, he had been pretty sensitive and withdrawn. They were just about ready to head out the door, and Charlie was looking at his very creepy but very unfinished costume sitting on the living room table. Nicole placed her hand on his shoulder and picked up one of the claw-like hands that were part of the costume and said, "It's time for school, buddy, but we'll finish your costume, whatever it's supposed to be, when we get home, and then we'll go terrorize the neighborhood, okay?" Charlie grinned a small, crooked smile. "Okay." Today we're going to be doing some arts and crafts, kids. Now, who can tell me some things that make us think of Halloween? Charlie's teacher asked. The kids began excitedly raising their hands and calling out answers simultaneously. Pumpkins, witches, ghosts, candy. Very good, the teacher said. Today we're going to be drawing the things that make us think of Halloween, or just some things we think are creepy and scary. It was towards the end of the school day, and all the kids were drawing and laughing, and after some time the teacher decided to approach Charlie. He'd been very quiet today, even more than normal lately, and she wanted to make another attempt to get him to be more engaged. She went to his desk and looked over his shoulder and watched as he was intensely, slowly creating a circle on his paper, alternating with red and black colors. The teacher was fixated on this shape of ink at the center of the page. What she could only describe as a chilling black and crimson void felt like it was actually pulling her into the paper. It had a hypnotizing glow to it, and she found it extremely hard to look away. What are you drawing, Charlie?" "The red?" "What's the red?" she asked, with her eyes still being pulled into the ink on the page. "I'm trying to remember," he said. He wasn't drawing anymore. They were both just staring at the paper. "Why did you choose to draw this today, Charlie?" "Well, because they make me think of Halloween," he said. "Who makes you think of Halloween?" she asked, confused. Charlie pointed to the edges of the paper. The shadows. The teacher hadn't noticed them before. She was so fixated on the center of the page, she hadn't seen the shadowy figures laying at the edges. She didn't know what they were or how he had seen them before, but they did not look like shadows to her. They didn't look like anything she had ever seen before. She stared blankly at the shadowy figures, momentarily paralyzed by fear. At pickup time, The teacher decided to wait for Nicole with Charlie. When Nicole arrived, Charlie's teacher gave her his drawings and asked if she knew anything about them. Oh, Charlie loves Halloween. He's been so excited he hasn't been sleeping well, and I think he's just using his overactive imagination again. The teacher glanced at Charlie, unsure of what to think, but mother knows best, right? They got home and noticed that the neighborhood was already teeming with Halloween night activities. Cedar Falls loved Halloween, and all the neighborhood families were very excited to get out and start trick-or-treating and creating mischief. Nicole took Charlie inside so they could finish his costume and get ready to head out. Nicole grabbed the supplies to finish Charlie's costume and sat down at the living room table. "This thing is pretty creepy, buddy," she said, looking at the shrunken face and the hollow eyes. "What are we making, anyway?" "It's me, and the shadows," Charlie answered. "So it's supposed to be like your alter shadow self kind of thing?" Nicole clarified. "I guess." Nicole finished up the stitching of the costume and final additions to the claws, and they started getting ready to head out. Charlie put his costume on and waited by the door, looking out on the street, getting darker and slowly beginning to fill up with other kids. "You ready, buddy? You got your pail?" Nicole said, coming down the stairs. "Ready," Charlie said, holding his traditional jack-o'-lantern pail. If it wasn't for that candy pail, Nicole thought, she wouldn't have any idea this kid was supposed to be a trick-or-treater. Why on earth he wanted to be something so terrifying, she didn't understand. All things considered, Charlie was doing great for his first real Halloween. He scared the living daylights out of just about every kid he crossed paths with, and while trick-or-treating, he even made some of the adults a little reluctant to answer their doors, unless he was in a group of less frightening-looking kids. As many of the kids were starting to return back to their respective houses in the neighborhood, a group of several close-by families were gathering near Nicole and Charlie's house. "Hey, I'm Tim. I live a couple doors down. I've seen you guys here and there, but haven't had the chance to introduce myself. Man, your kid's got a killer costume." "Oh, hey, thanks. I'm Nicole. That's Charlie. He certainly has an eye for creepy things." "Oh, and this is my daughter Jill," Tim said. "Hi, Jill," Charlie's mom said. "I like your vampire costume. Why don't you guys go sit on the grass and trade some candy?" Charlie and Jill began walking away, and just as they were approaching Charlie's yard to sit down, Charlie grabbed Jill's arm and said, "I'm sorry." And he began aggressively dragging her across the yard towards his house. This would have been frightening enough as it was, but with the combination of Charlie's costume, Jill was petrified, and she let out the most bone-chilling scream that neighborhood has ever heard. Tim immediately left the conversation with Nicole and ran over to the children, who were just opening the front door and heading inside Charlie's house. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Tim said, breaking Jill free from Charlie's grip. Charlie's eyes shifted upstairs towards his bedroom. There was a small red glow that was slowly disappearing. Nicole caught up and interjected, "I'll deal with him. I'm so sorry. Just wait here a second." Nicole closed the door and turned around upset. "Charlie, what has gotten into you? Why did you do that to that little girl?" Charlie, who was still staring up the stairs, said, "I needed her." "For what, Charlie?" she pleaded. "To replace you. For the shadows." "That's enough, Charlie. No more of this. Halloween is over. I'm going to go outside and make sure that Jill is okay. I need you to take off that costume and head to your room. I'll be up in a minute." Nicole stepped outside and approached Tim and Jill. "I'm really sorry, you guys. I don't know what that was. He's been having a hard time lately, and he's been overly excited about Halloween. I think he was just trying to scare you." "Well, he did a great job with that. Look, it's not my business beyond this incident. but I fear there's something really wrong with that kid, Nicole," said Tim, as he picked up his daughter and fled from their yard. Nicole was heartbroken. The night had suddenly taken a terrible turn. She needed to find out more from Charlie about this, so she headed inside and went upstairs to speak with him. But when she got into his room, the lights were off and Charlie was in bed. Only it looked like he still had his costume on. "You were supposed to take that off, Charlie." "I did," he said. "Well, clearly you put it back on, but since it's still technically your birthday, I guess you can have one more night with it. Get some rest, buddy. We'll talk more tomorrow." She figured she would throw the costume out in the morning. Might as well let him enjoy it. She tucked him in and headed downstairs to the living room. She started picking up some things from around the house and stopped in her tracks when she passed by the living room table. Charlie's costume was laying on the table, bunched up from having been taken off. And yet she had just seen Charlie upstairs, wearing that very costume. Her eyes darted up the stairs towards Charlie's room, where she saw a haunting red glow coming out from under the door. She frantically rushed up the stairs and into Charlie's room. Upon entering his room, she saw him standing there, near a glowing red void. And to her horror, Charlie was no longer Charlie. The room was filled with a few shadowy figures, and all of them, including Charlie, looked exactly like Charlie's costume. Dark, shadowy figures with sunken faces and terrible claws. They were whispering to Charlie, "We made a deal, Charlie. That was our last chance, Charlie. Time to go, Charlie." Charlie stepped towards the edge of the void. Nicole stepped towards him and reached out. But a shadowy figure stepped in between and stopped her in her tracks. Her blood was freezing over. "Count your blessings," the shadow whispered to Nicole. As Charlie was at the edge of the void, his room completely flooded with the glowing red light, he looked back at his mother and said, "I couldn't do it. You were so good to me this time." He raised his horrifying, claw-like hand and waved goodbye as he stepped into the void. Well, folks, I hope you've enjoyed this first episode of Haunted Headphones and the telling of this first Haunted Headphones original story. This is just one of the many types of content that we'll be bringing you here on Haunted Headphones. And we'll be doing many other things in addition to original stories. So if you liked what you heard and you would like to continue your journey through the strange land with me, be sure to follow and subscribe so you don't miss out. And with that, dear listeners, I'd like to say thank you one more time and wish you the happiest of Halloweens. Stay tuned and stay strange.